Good afternoon. Thanks for coming to hang out in this kind of post-lunch slumber. I just had a really awesome grilled cheese with some tomato soup. It was so good. So we're going to talk about Flexbox today. Who's had a chance to kind of tinker around with it? All right, good bit of folks. Do you like it? Love it? Is it challenging? Well, good deal. So the first thing we're going to do this afternoon is solve the hardest problem known to the web, right? We're going to do it in like 2 minutes, and then we can go home. We're done for the day. We've accomplished all that we have to accomplish here at FITC. And that problem is vertically aligning and centering a box, right? Hardest thing ever. We've been trying to do it for years. We've done it with JavaScript. We try to do it with CSS and like negative margins and positioning and just crazy stuff. That kind of sort of works. But now we can do it with Flexbox. And if you wanted to take that box and center it vertically and horizontally, that's all of the CSS that we need to write, right? So it's pretty magical what CSS can do nowadays. Now, before we really dig into all the good things that we can do with Flexbox today, we're going to give a really quick history in layout and kind of what got us here, if that helps, all right? So first things first, if you've been working on the web for, I don't know, maybe over a decade and a half, you might recall something called the Holy Grail layout. It was what we tried to achieve, like the pinnacle of our achievement a decade ago as front-end developers, and it was creating something kind of like that, right? A heading, a footer, 3 boxes in the middle, and that's what we tried to do. Now, the challenge with doing this type of layout is the middle bits. Now, in the beginning, we did this with tables. Out of curiosity, not to date anybody, but who's had to build this before with tables? Ah, you have a special place in my heart. Good times. Now, tables were an interesting beast in that we could take something like this, and you can make it pretty much work. Now, as the web progressed and CSS became a thing, it used not to be, for those of us that have been around a little while, before CSS was a thing, that middle section was a huge pain. During tables, post tables, and this is kind of why, right? When CSS came along and we started to write semantic markup, remove tables from our markup and begin to use semantic markup, we use this thing called floats. Now, floats have been widely used now for quite a while, and the challenge with floats is when you float something to the left or to the right, the parent container kind of collapses in, right? Whereas tables, they maintain the height of whatever that row is going to be. The second challenge with tables and also floats, we just really can't do sticky footers. And for whatever reason, we really want sticky footers. So we have, assume my red dotted line is our viewport. If the content isn't tall enough to fill out the viewport, it does what the web does. There's this nice ebb and flow, and things kind of collapse in on each other. And now we did crazy things back then to try and fake the column height and fake sticky footers, where you would do like background images and give things like a height of like 2,000 pixels, and then like a negative margin, and just like crazy things to make it look like the background was going the entire height of a column. Those days are no more. So to illustrate kind of the example of floats specifically and the pain that it has caused us over the number of years is what we have, I think Nicole Sullivan calls a media object, right? You see this on Facebook, you see this on blog posts where you have a box. That box has some type of media, and then within that media we have some type of content. Some of that may be metadata, dates, time ago that it was posted, and then paragraphs or lists or whatever's in the content section. Now, if we were to take my glorious profile, right, and float that bad boy to the left, because we floated it, the parent container, the box, just kind of goes bloop and bumps up against the next element that hasn't been floated yet. Now, if we were to take my glorious mug and float that to the left and then float the content to the right, then the parent container collapses in on itself, which was hugely frustrating back in the day. Because we don't really want it to do that. Our box is still there. We want our box to still look like a box. So what we ended up doing is create this thing called the ClearFix. Chung chung, right? So ClearFix came about, I don't recall who came up with the original concept, but essentially we're using before and after pseudo-selectors in CSS to dump in essentially a fake element before and after our content inside the box, right? So what that allows us to do is prevent the parent container from collapsing in on itself, which was pretty cool, right? Back in the day, that was pretty awesome. But CSS was so hacky for so many years, and it still kind of is, trying to get boxes to do what we want, right? So the second caveat is we have grid systems. Now, grid systems have been around for a while. They come from the good old days of print, where we're trying to align things consistently based off of a grid. Now, back in the day, there were numerous grid systems around where we were taking divs, essentially, and floating them to the left, and maybe floating the last grid to the right. And that would give us a nice, fluid grid system. Now, there were 12-column grid systems and 16-column grid systems and 8-column grid systems. I used 960 grid way back when, and it was great, right? It was good stuff. Now, the challenge with using percentages specifically to create a grid system is you're typically doing your floats and the widths of those columns with a couple decimal points and then lots of numbers after the decimal points. Now, browsers are pixel-based, right? So they can't quite correctly calculate 12.88888% and align that to pixels. They try their darndest. And a weird thing happens when you try and do that. Can anybody pick up what happens? Yeah, it's annoying, right? We get, on that very last column, we get an odd space. It doesn't quite align with the other grid. So floats for grids, they were kind of a pain. Now, we're going to talk about kind of how we can redo some of this. But first things first, let's talk about Flexbox and grid. So Flexbox is a standard. Grid is also a standard. And what I've kind of seen online is we're trying to force kind of a standards war to a certain degree, where it's grid versus Flexbox. And that's not really the case. They both have very distinct purposes. Now, we're going to talk specifically on Flexbox today, but it's important to know that something like this is probably better akin to use grid whenever it's supported fully, right? Creating a grid system, it's probably best to use grid because that's what it's there for. Now, something like our media object, Flexbox, totally Flexbox all the time. So Flexbox as a standard, and the way that we probably should use that is for component-based layouts, right? There'll be a new spec coming soon that allow us to handle grid as a whole, building grid systems. Flexbox is great for components. Now, if grid is something that's interesting to you, there are two folks that are pretty darn amazing that are just all grid all the time. So Jen Simmons and Rachel Andrew, they both have really great content that they're starting to put out. Rachel just finished a video series that I believe is free around grid system, and then Jen is just going crazy experimental, mad scientist. So she has a site up at labs.jensimmons.com that just shows all the crazy things that she's trying to do with grid, specific to art direction. So if you work in publishing or came from the print industry, she has some really great stuff that will make you feel pretty nostalgic because you can do some of that on the web now. Okay, so all that aside, let's dig into Flexbox. Now, one of the most important things to note about Flexbox is it doesn't quite work like floats, okay? When we're floating something, we're writing properties specific to the thing that we want to float. Flexbox, on the other hand, works on the parent container. So we might have 10 elements, right, inside of that parent container. We don't really do anything necessarily to those 10 child components. Everything that we typically do within Flexbox, we do on the parent. So what you're going to see in my HTML examples on the right-hand side, left-hand side, is there's always going to be a container, And that's the thing where I'm declaring most of my CSS properties to make Flexbox do what we want it to do. So first things first, we have a parent container, which assume is made up by our nice blue area or black area, depending on how that comes through in the projector. And then we have a box. So just keep it simple. We have a parent container, and then we have boxes. In some cases, lots of boxes. And we want to do things to those boxes by poking on the parent container, adding property to the parent container. So first things first, to make any child elements inside of a parent container, on the parent container, we're going to set the display to flex, right? Not too bad. So we're going to set that to flex. That's going to make any child, right, direct children inside of that parent, behave like Flexbox, right? So let's say that we have more than one box. Now, by default, we can set the parent container to flex, and then we can change the flex direction. So you can take those boxes and you can reorient them directionally. So in this case, the default is row. So we're going to default to row. Now, we can also use a property and set that value to row reverse. And what that will do is it will take that list of boxes and kind of mirror those to a certain degree. So it kind of flips them. So previously, with normal row, it's 1, 2, 3, 4. If we flip that with row reverse, we get 4, 3, 2, 1, and it's essentially right aligned, left aligned, something like that, right aligned on my screen. Now, we can also do really nifty things with columns, which has always kind of been somewhat of a pain. So we can, again, we set the parent container to display flex. We have those same 4 boxes. We're not really doing anything to them. We're just changing the parent, and it's affecting the children. So we can set the flex direction to column, and it's going to lay those out top to bottom. Now, similarly, we can also set that to column reverse, and it's going to flip those 4, 3, 2, 1. All good so far? Not too terrible? Okay. So the next thing that's important is the flex wrap property. Now, Flexbox inherently is going, let's say you have 100 child elements or 100 boxes. It's going to try and shove 100 boxes in a single row. And sometimes that's not really what we want it to do. So Flexbox defaults to this property flex wrap, and it sets everything to wrap. No wrap, apologies. So it sets everything to no wrap, and it's just going to fill up that row with as many children as you put inside that parent container. It doesn't really matter how much you put in. It's just going to keep making them smaller and smaller and smaller until it looks pretty bad. Now, to make it not do that, we just set the property flex wrap to wrap. Now, Flexbox kind of does its own math behind the scenes. We're not declaring widths or anything like that. Flexbox is looking at the content inside the container, how small it can make those, and then it's kind of determining or calculating the width of what that box should be. So when we tell it to wrap, it's going to make its best guess. So if you're used to having really fine-grained control around what's wrapping and what isn't, you're going to have to give up just a little bit of it, right? It's the web. There's some ebb and flow going on. Now, not to say that you can't do that, but you give up a little bit of control, like fine-grained control, which is fine. Like, we're all doing responsive design now. Things are kind of squishy. It's not a big deal. Okay, so we can also use wrap reverse. Now, it does the same thing. So it's going to wrap, but it's going to flip those or invert those boxes. So whatever was on the second row, it's going to put it on top, right? Okay. Now, as with any CSS properties, we have shorthands. So if we wanted to take all of those and kind of combine them into one shorthand, we have, let's see, flex flow, right? So flex flow, you can combine those 2 properties together, and you can change those as you need, right? So if you dig shorthand, use the shorthand. Okay, so the fun stuff, right? We talked about vertically and horizontally centering boxes, centering content. Flexbox has 2 properties, and it took me a little while to wrap my head around which property actually centered what. So whether it was on the x-axis or the y-axis, kind of what it does. So we have this justified content. Now, what justified content is going to do is it's going to center things across this axis. Now, we can also adjust the end that content aligns to. So we have flex end and flex start. So like if you're thinking of this in like current CSS terms, we have float left, we have float right, And then we kind of have our hacky centering where you do like a margin 0 auto, and it will center some of those things in there. Now, Flex gives us a bit more control. So we have Flex In that is essentially aligning it to one side. We have Flex Center, which centers everything in the middle. And then we have Flex Start that dumps it over on the other side, right? So Flex Start, one side. Flex End, the other side. Then we have Center, right? So it just dumps everything in the middle. Now, with that, you're going to notice that we have a good bit of extra space on the left and right-hand side. Now, with Justify Content, we can do a few different things as well. We can also do something called Space Between. Now, what Space Between does is it calculates the width of each box. It calculates the available space either on the left or right-hand side that it's not using up. And then it kind of calculates that space and puts it in between each of our Flexbox boxes, right? Similar, we also can do spaced around. So if you want, here's the difference, right? Space between bumps the first and last box up against the edges and dump space in between, kind of like it says. Space around does even margins, essentially, on the left and right-hand side, and then in between each of our boxes. Now, one of the challenges that we have, and the challenge that we had when we're using floats, is having something go the height that we want it to go. In order for that to work in Flexbox, we can use LineItems. Now, we can set the property LineItems to stretch, and that will expand to the full height of whatever it's in. So, LineItems also kind of works on the opposite axis as Justify Content. So LineItems is the other side. So again, we have a Flex Start that aligns all our items to the top. And then we have Flex In that dumps everything down on the bottom, which is super hard to do. We do this now in JavaScript in most cases. We want to take, we have this parent container and it has a height, but we don't want things to always be at the top. We want it to be at the bottom. We've been hacking that for so long. Flexbox makes it really easy for us to do. And then to align things vertically, horizontally, I'm going to mix those two things up the entire presentation, I promise. I've been trying this. I just can't do it. So we can center those in the middle, right, using a LineItem center. Now, we have similar things to do things vertically, where we have a LineItem stretch. So if we have a lot, it's going to stretch those as much as it can, and then wrap as necessary. So they're all going to take up the same height across all of our boxes, right, for the row. We have Flex Start that's going to take all of our boxes and put them at the top left-hand corner. We have Flex End that's going to take everything and put them on the bottom, right? And then again, we have Flex Item Center. So however many boxes we have, it's going to put them all in rows and then center them in the viewport. We have similar options to do space between, right? So it's going to do all the space in between each row. And then we have space around that's going to give us equal spacing top, bottom, and in between, essentially. Okay? So those are all of the properties that we can use to affect the parent container. Right? So up until now, we haven't done anything to a specific box. Everything that we've done so far is on the parent. And that's what kind of makes Flexbox weird in my mind, because we're so used to, if we want to change a box, we write a property specific to that box. Flexbox, it doesn't work that way. It took me probably way too long to understand that. So we can work on specific elements. So we can write properties on specific boxes, if you want to call it that. So probably don't ever write CSS like this in production. It's probably a bad idea. But this is to illustrate what we can do with CSS. So what we're using right now is we're using the order property. Now, this is one of the most magical things in my mind that you can do with Flexbox. So let's say that we have 5 boxes, and we do because it's in the example. So we have 5 boxes. Now, you're going to notice they're not 1 through 5. They're 2, 1, 4, 5, 3. So what we can do on an individual box is we can change the order that those boxes visually appear without having to change the DOM, which is oh so magical. So if you're working in a production setting and source order is important to you, and it should be if you're doing anything with accessibility, this allows you to have the source order, whatever is most beneficial for accessibility, but visually change things that makes the most sense for folks that need to see the screen. It also works really great when you're building grid systems if you wanted to do that, or if you're doing things in a responsive context and you have content that should be prioritized on mobile versus on desktop. You can just change the order with your CSS, right? And it'll change visually how that appears in the viewport. Pretty magical in my mind. Now, other things that we can do is we don't want all of our boxes to always be the same width. We may want to adjust those as needed to make them visually look correct. So another property that we have on our box elements is we have something called FlexGrow. Now, what FlexGrow will do is it's going to take a look at all of the width of the boxes that we have, and it's going to grow it essentially by a ratio of that box. So in this case, we're just doing FlexGrow to 1. Everything's going to be the same width, right? And it's going to try and fill up all of the horizontal space that we have in a row. We can also use Flex Shrink, that essentially does the converse. So it's going to look at all of those, the boxes in our row, and it's going to shrink based off the ratio of everything else that's in there. So if you wanted to take box 3 and increase that essentially twice the size, give or take, we can set Flex Grow for that third box by 2. So it's going to double the width visually how it looks. Now again, you're not giving this a percentage, you're not giving it a width. Flexbox doesn't really work that way. Now you can kind of, sort of make it do that, but it's not precise, right? So you're not explicitly able to use this property and go, I want this to be exactly 200 pixels all the time. You'd really just have to use the width property to do that. Okay, so again, on these you also have shorthand. So we can use Flex 1, 2, which takes a couple of those properties and kind of shoves them into one. So we can do that if you want. I personally write it out longhand because my brain is still trying to wrap my hand around what the shorthand actually means. Because it's not quite like margins or paddings where it's consistent. It's weird in my brain still. So I write it out because it makes me think better. Okay, so we've talked a lot about Flexbox, and if it's something that you're still trying to wrap your head around, there are a handful of resources out there that will help you learn nifty things. They're also kind of fun to work with. So the first one that I kind of dig is Flexbox Froggy. Anybody ever used that before? Not enough people. It's great. So it walks you through all of these properties in kind of a gamified fashion. Pretty neat to work with if you like frogs, right? Second one is Flexbox in 5. It's a bit more long-form typing. It walks you through all of the Flexbox items in about 5 minutes, essentially. It's good to just kind of go through. Now, all of the examples that I gave, there are code pins of each one. So if you want to take real live examples and poke around on those in CodePen and really see what does what with the properties yourself, the links at the very top of that screen. I'll also tweet this out and hand it over to the FITC folks so they can send that out to folks when they do their speaker notes at the end. So you can play around with them, right? Okay, so let's talk about some things that are a bit more useful, right? So you've learned basic Flexbox stuff, and there's a good bit to it. There are many more properties involved with Flexbox as a system than most of our other properties, right? So we're going to walk you through a bit more complex layouts and kind of how those work. So the first thing, so what we have is we have a couple of panes, and what we want those panes to do, we want them to always be the full height of the viewport. We want them to be essentially 50% of the screen, and we want it to take up the screen. Now, inside of that, we have some type of media, we have some headings and some content, and we want those to always be centered horizontally and vertically within each of our panes. Make enough sense? So HTML-wise, we have a pane that is our parent container, and then we have two panes that are our child elements, and then the other stuff kind of inside of that we don't really care too much about right now. And we're going to write some Flexbox code to make that layout do what we want it to do. Now, it is surprisingly easy to do that type of layout because essentially we're not really doing too much to the children, to our panes. We're writing CSS to affect the pane itself, and that in turn affects the children's side. So we're going to set panes. Okay, the first step to anything you do with Flexbox is you have to set display to flex on the parent. Otherwise, you're just going to rip your hair out because, like, why isn't it working? So set it to flex. Now, I'm going ahead and I'm putting in some of the default values. You don't have to write out all of these, but just so you can see what's going on under the hood. We're setting flex direction to row, which is the default. And then we're setting flex wrap to wrap. And then we're going to justify that to the center. Now, for the height, we're going to use 100 VH, which has nothing to do with Flexbox, but it's magical. So it's essentially telling our panes to always be 100% essentially of the view height, the viewport height. Now you can adjust that as you want, but it's always going to be top to bottom, whatever your viewport height is, it's going to resize based off of that. It's pretty magical. And that's really like we're setting text align to center, but again, it has nothing to do with Flexbox, and we're setting the width of our pane to 100%. Now, what that does is it sets up our boxes for us. It makes those do what we need them to do, to always be full height, to be 50% width, and then on the panes itself. Now, we're going to set flex again, so we're going to set that twice because each pane also has their own children. So we want to affect those children so that we can use Flexbox on them. So Flexbox, when you set it to the parent, it doesn't affect the grandchildren, only the direct children. So in order to affect the grandchildren, we also have to set the child pane elements to flex. So we do that. We're going to set our flex direction to column. We're going to justify content to center. Now, that does it horizontally, vertically, one of the two. You know what I'm talking about. Vertically, thank you. It sets it vertically, and then our width's going to be 100%, right? And that's it. That's all the CSS that you really have to write to get that type of layout. Now, I could imagine trying to do that with JavaScript and like doing really hacky CSS. It's a bit heavier-handed than just like basic stuff. It's some of that stuff you don't even need. Okay? So next example. We're going to go back to the Holy Grail because I'm feeling a little bit nostalgic today. So we have the Holy Grail, and if I was writing the markup, it might look something kind of like this. So I have a masthead, and then I have a container, and that container has something for content, something for navigation, and something for an aside, like secondary content. We're going to call it a sidebar, and then we have our footer. Now, we want to set this up so that, well, the heading's easy, right? The masthead's easy. We want the columns to always be the full height of whatever they need to be. And we kind of want a sticky footer because, you know, why not? We're going to want one eventually. Some designer somewhere or some stakeholder is going to go, I really wish that footer wasn't way up here when we didn't have a lot of content. I really want it to be like down on the bottom. So we're going to do that anyway. So in order to do that, we're going to do some stuff on the body itself. Now, for the body, we're going to set the height to 100%. Now, this is kind of important to give us some room to grow for Flexbox. And then the body, I'm keeping this really simple. Normally, you wouldn't set body to flex. That might be dangerous. But in this case, I have one child element, which is my container, and that's what I want to affect. So I'm going to set my body to flex, and I'm going to set flex direction to column. So that's going to take my header, or my masthead, is going to take my main content, my body, and it's going to take my footer, and it's going to lay those out long-wise, right? Now, inside of that, I'm going to drill into it, and I'm going to do some stuff with my container itself. So that container, I'm also going to set to flex. Now, I'm going to set that to flex 1, because I want that to go full width, right? Because I have 3 things inside of that. And then I'm going to focus on the innards. Now, in my markup, the most important thing that I have here is my content. I want that to be before my navigation. I want that to be before my aside, or my secondary content, my sidebar. So I'm going to set my content to flex 1. And then my navigation, you're going to see me using flex basis and order. So in the source order, my content's first, and my navigation's here, and my sidebar's here. Visually, I want it to be navigation content sidebar. So I'm setting flex base at 30%, so it's a little bit smaller. And then I'm going to order my content -1. So visually, it's going to take that and kind of move it on the other side of my content. And then last but not least, we have our sidebar. The sidebar, I'm going to use flex bases again. I want this to kind of be a percentage and to kind of grow and shrink with the browser width. So I'm going to set my flex basis to, I think that's 20%, 30%, something like that. And yeah, that's essentially it. That's all that I have to write CSS-wise to create the Holy Grail layout, right? Not a lot to it, not a lot of crazy hacky JavaScript to make things do what we want it to do. Inherently, my footer is going to do its thing because I set the body to 100%. Now, if I wanted to change the Holy Grail layout and modernize that a little bit, to do something like modern web apps, like we typically have, like an email system, right? You have a couple columns on the left-hand side that are kind of small. You have the main content. Now, I'm not really changing any of my markup. The only thing that I'm really doing is changing the order. So I'm taking my sidebar, I'm taking my navigation, and I'm just dumping those over. So my navigation I've set to -2 on the order. My sidebar I've set to -1. And there we go. We have same markup, different layout, different context. Magical stuff, right? Okay, let's go on to something a little bit more complex. Now, if you work in e-commerce or anything like that, or you have the portfolio site like everybody has, it has like the icon and the text, and like icon and text and icon and text, and I have like 6 of those boxes, you could totally use this. So what we have is we have a bunch of cards, is what I'm going to call them. Now, we have cards as the parent, so I'm using just kind of a plural singular naming convention. So we have cards, which are multiples, and then we have an individual card. Now, inside of that card, we have some images and like a title. We might have some type of descriptor attached to that. And I just have as many of those as I kind of need. So markup-wise, it's pretty light. The only thing that we really need to affect CSS-wise are my cards and my individual card. So again, I have my cards. I'm going to set my parent container to display flex. I'm going to set flex flow to row wrap because I want the rows to wrap. I don't want them all to be on one row. And then I'm going to set my cards using shorthand to 1, 0, 25%. So this is essentially setting my my width of the boxes so I have at least 4 per row, right? That makes sense? Now, I'm doing something a little bit weird where I'm kind of chaining a handful of last child and inch child selectors. And what that will do, it will take the last row, and however many items that I put in that last row, it will adjust the width. So whatever's in there is going to adjust to be full width. So if there's 2 on the last row, it'll make them 50%. If the numbers don't quite line up, it'll do that automatically for us. If I have one last one kind of straggling, it'll do that. That's not the best solution, but it'll kind of ebb and flow on its own depending on how many items that you put in there. So yeah, that's one example of what we can do with Flexbox. And it's really just that code. That's it. That's all you really have to write to create that type of system. Now, accessibility is an important topic, right? Totally is. So Flexbox adds some interesting things with accessibility and how we might handle some of that. So let's go back to our Holy Grail layout and talk a little bit about DOM order. Now, what Flexbox will do is my DOM order is this, right? Where I have my navigation first in the DOM, then I have my content, then I have my sidebar. So if a screen reader looks at this, it's going to look at content, navigation, sidebar, which is kind of what we want. Now, the visual order, right? The visual order kind of changes. So we're seeing our sidebar first, we're seeing our content second, we're seeing our navigation first, our content second, our sidebar third. Now, when a screen reader comes in and it looks at that content, it's going to read it in that order, right? So it's going to read our content first, it's going to read our navigation second, and it's going to be our sidebar third. So if you're doing crazy things with Flexbox and you're reordering things, and you need the screen reader to see something further down in the DOM, but you've only changed things visually, it's going to follow a DOM order, right? So just be aware that even though you're visually adjusting things, currently it's going to follow a DOM order. Screen readers have no idea what to do with Flexbox, right? It's too new. Now, another important question, browser support. Can we use this now? Yeah, mostly, kind of. So here's what we have. So full support is in Chrome 21 and up, Safari 6.1 and up, Firefox 28 and up, Opera 12.1 and up. And then iEdge is doing pretty good. I wish they had released that a number of years ago. That would have saved us all a lot of grief. So full support in all those browsers. You can use all the Flexbox stuff that you want to use. Now, because IE is IE sometimes, there's like kind of, sort of, partial support in IE 10 and 11. It gets a little bit better with 11, but it's still not quite there. So just be aware. If your target audience is using IE 10 and 11, you have to have some type of fallback. Otherwise, all your glorious Flexbox stuff is going to kind of eat flaming death and not work very well, right? Okay, so that's really all that I have. So we have some time for some Q&A. Now, I do open office hours every Friday from about 7 to 9. It's all online. If you ever want to chat, let me know. They're in 10-minute chunks. You can find it at officehours.io. And then if you ever want to chat over Twitter or Skype or email, like all my stuff's Bermon Painter. There are very few Bermons in the world. So I'm really easy to track down online. If you're lucky, you might find my father, who is the only other living Bermon that I'm aware of. But he's on like page 3 or 4 of Google. So really easy to find. So let me know. So questions? Oh, there we go. There's like a big light right above your head. So this question is essentially, is there a performance impact with doing complex layouts? Probably, like a little bit. Like the browsers are trying to calculate a whole bunch of stuff. Now, if you're doing a lot of extra visuals with like box shadow and anything like that that's painting a whole bunch of stuff to the screen, yeah, if it gets complex, it's going to impact performance. It's getting better with time. But yeah, that's something I would definitely just open up in your dev tools and see what repainting is going on and how much that's impacting how it feels. But yeah, there is some. Yeah, so his question is, when you're tabbing through the site, what does it use to, I guess, calculate the order that it's going to tab? Everything goes off of DOM order, right? So it's always going to do DOM order, screen readers and tabbing. So be aware of that. We'll do you and then you. So his question was, did you recommend using, do I recommend using Flexbox from the ground up? What else was it? Or if there's a good strategy for introducing it throughout the application. So that's one of those it depends, which is a terrible cop-out. So if you're building an internal application and you have full control over the browsers that people are using, yeah, totally, why not? Because you can dictate, you've got to use the latest and greatest stuff. And we have some internal client. I'm a consultant, so I work at a consultancy. We do a lot of internal applications for companies, and they dictate, you have to use this browser and this version. Anything else we don't support, which is really awesome. Like, that is the best situation. If you're doing something that's public-facing, it gets a bit more dicey, especially if your core audience are using older versions of IE. Now, it's totally fine to start with Flexbox and then using something like Modernizer to just do feature detection, and you just have to make sure you have those fallbacks. You can have those in a separate style sheet, but you kind of have to write the layout twice if you have to support that. For some companies, that can be cost and time prohibitive. I think it's totally worth it because as those numbers decrease, you don't have to rewrite the application. You can just depreciate the older styles, and once, whatever that metric is that allows you to make older browser support go away, then you already have the code base. That's what I would recommend. It's just a little bit extra work going into it. If you have some really good CSS devs, it probably shouldn't be a problem. Like they've probably been doing floats for years by now, and it's just a little extra work that they would have to do to support non-Flexbox browsers. So any caveats to using Flexbox for mobile? None that I'm aware of. Now, it goes back to older devices, right? So it depends on how far back you're supporting. Most of the mobile vendors do a pretty good job with support. If you have any questions around, like if you're supporting older browsers and you're not quite sure how far back Flexbox support goes, Can I Use is pretty good. Like we use it all the time. It's like, we have to support like these 5 mobile browsers. Do we really have to? Like, what can we do here, right? Yeah.
So, Flexbox came out a couple of years ago, right? And it's kind of establishing itself. I hear there's something called Grid.
Mm-hmm.
How's that going to stand next to Flexbox? Is that going to be parallel and it's a method or the other, or is that going to replace it?
Yeah, so in my humble opinion, so Grid and Flexbox are really companion tools, right? They're companion specs, where Grid is really geared towards writing fairly complex grid system, fairly complex layout. Flexbox, you can write complex layouts and you can write big grid systems, but Flexbox really works better for like component level layout. So if I'm building a pattern library, when I'm working on individual patterns, Flexbox is really good there. Now, the challenge with Grid, and it's getting a lot better, is the support is terrible still. Like it's in Chrome, it's coming into Safari. I want to say it's in Safari's like pre-release candidate, whatever they call those now. But in Chrome, you have to explicitly turn the flag on so you can use Grid. So maybe in 6 months, we'll have better support because the browser vendors are moving a good bit faster than they were a decade ago. But it's probably a good 1.5 years, maybe a couple years before it's really, truly supported, I think. Maybe they'll surprise us, and we'll be really happy. So we have time for no questions, one question? One question. That's a good question. I don't know. Maybe. That'd be a good experiment. You can tweet it at me, and we'll see what happens. I would assume so, but I don't really know. I've never tried. All right. That's all we have. Thanks, everybody.